Our next speaker is Kara Heitz. For more than a decade, she has been in higher education teaching. She's taught for over 5 years at the Kansas City Art Institute, where she teaches courses on 20th century American history, cultural studies, and film history. Heitz also runs a media company that creates historically focused documentaries and podcasts, including the award-winning film A New Deal for Public Art in the Free State, featuring those post office murals here in Kansas. Heitz earned her master's degree from the London School of Economics and George Washington University and is working on a PhD in history from the University of Kent at Canterbury. She is a member of the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau, so if you wanted to, you could invite her to come speak at your institution. Welcome, Kara.
But thank you so much to Liz and everyone here at the Beach Museum. It's been an honor to be a part of this exhibition. So as Liz mentioned, I guess I've done a film about New Deal art, but really this is I do a lot of public history work, but my main area of academic expertise is New Deal arts and culture programs in Kansas. And this is something that I have been researching for, I think, at least 5 years now, if not 6, and will probably take me another 5 years to actually go through all the archival material. But I wanted to start out, before I kind of get into the details about New Deal arts programs and how schools, K through 12, as well as institutions of higher education received art from New Deal programs, I wanted to kind of start out with this letter, because there's this great connection to the Beach Museum here. So this is from the National Archives, the WPA archives. This is a letter from the Kansas, and I'll explain what all of this is, the WPA's Federal Art Project Director, John Helm, to Mrs. Fabian Williams-Wolf. And John Helm actually was an art instructor here at Kansas State University, I think from the mid-20s to 1970. I think he was here for a substantial period of time, and I believe was instrumental in starting the university's art collection, which then would be the core of the Beach Museum's art collection. But from 1935 to early 1937, he was also the director of the Kansas WPA's Federal Art Project. So this is a letter that he's writing to Mrs. Fabian Williams-Wolf, who was a member of the Kansas WPA's Federal Art Project Committee. She also was secretary of the Topeka Art Guild, and she was a high school art teacher in the Topeka Public Schools. So, and that's her picture from the Topeka High School Hall of Fame, which is my alma mater, and there's John Helm. And so this letter is kind of laying out, it's from July 13th, 1937, the different kinds of arts programs that are being started. So the Federal Art Program and Federal Art Project in Kansas is just kind of starting to get going. And John Helm is explaining to this member of the art committee what's going on. And actually the title for this section of the exhibition I took from this letter. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I just want to point out this one part. We are very anxious to have these prints sent to the smaller schools of the state, where there is a dire need for good pictures. We feel that in this way, we will be not only assisting good artists, but developing art appreciation in the schools by distributing these prints. And I think it's interesting because this resonates with things that both Liz and Corey touched on, this whole idea of getting art into places, into public spaces like schools. And why do we want to do that? And I'm going to add the layer in the New Deal story is, part of the story is also about providing jobs to artists who are out of work. But there's still this main underlying current of everybody should have access to art. That you could be in the smallest rural school in the most remote corner of Kansas, and you still, in a way, almost have the right to encounter beauty and to sort of have art help provide civic uplift, especially at a time period, right? We're talking about the Great Depression era now, and also as the New Deal art programs go on into the early 40s, not just the Great Depression, but a global war. So you're talking about a time period where people kind of need some uplift, right? So, you know, oh, well, that's okay. So there's all of this different stuff going on. So why distribute art to schools during this era of the Great Depression? Well, artists need jobs, right? They're out of work too, like everyone else. But it's still this continuation of this story that Liz was talking about that starts in the Progressive era and really underpins a lot of these New Deal art programs, democratizing art. The Kansas version of it is San Zane's Art for All. So the New Deal story of how art in Kansas got into school, New Deal art got into schools, is about both of these internal and external factors. I mean, externally, you have all of these ideas that have been percolating nationally in America about, you know, bringing sort of, you know, beauty and into public spaces and civic uplift. But then that extends into a lot of these New Deal philosophies about bringing art into these spaces. But there's also this very unique Kansas story that has to do with places like McPherson, and that has very much to do with San Zane, that this was a place in the 1930s that was already ripe for these ideas and had already been putting them into practice. So the New Deal story, New Deal art story in Kansas is both part of this larger story, but for a state its size, population-wise, Kansas had pretty extensive New Deal arts programs. And I think part of that reason is this history that this exhibition is documenting prior to the 1930s. So just really quickly, first I just want to give you a quick overview about the New Deal arts programs that would be relevant to schools. I also want us to think about why the federal government would fund the arts during the Depression and specifically in Kansas. And then, because I'm an educator, right, I teach college students, at least I don't have to deal with parents. That's what makes my job good. So I'm always thinking, and I teach art students, I teach at the Kansas City Art Institute, so I teach very visually, but I'm not trained as an art historian, I'm a good old-fashioned regular historian. So I'm not thinking so much about aesthetics or about technique. I'm thinking about, you know, what does this art produced by the New Deal in Kansas, especially the pieces that went into schools, what can it tell us about American culture, about Kansas and Kansans in the 1930s and 1940s? What kinds of images, what kinds of scenes, what kinds of depictions of Kansas life did Kansans connect to in this period of economic uplift, and how you can utilize that as teachers and as educators, right? It's a history lesson. So really quickly, when we think about the New Deal during the Great Depression, right, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and especially the jobs programs aspects of the New Deal, we often think of organizations like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which in 1939 actually changed to the Works Projects Administration, because progress was controversial by 1939, but fortunately it had the same acronym, right? We think of the WPA, we think of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, these kinds of large-scale jobs programs engaging in public works projects like building bridges, roads, planting trees, right? We have all these shelter belts in the Midwest, et cetera. All of these kinds of heavy construction projects, buildings, all this kind of stuff. But the New Deal also, particularly the WPA, had a number of programs aimed at artists and the arts. You know, as I said, artists have to eat too, right? They're out of work. So during the Great Depression and the early years of World War II, so these programs run from about 1934 to 1943, the federal government nationally engages in an unprecedented support of the arts, and I would say unprecedented even till today. So these programs administered by the WPA and other agencies were aimed, as I said before, both at providing work for unemployed artists, like many of these other jobs programs, but also had this dual purpose as promoting art and culture in a nation that was ravaged by economic uncertainties and hardship, right? And President Roosevelt himself is said to have declared, quote, 100 years from now, and we're almost there, 100 years from now, my administration will be known for its art, not its relief. So I think that's pretty astounding. So one of the main programs, there's multiple New Deal arts programs. I'm more than happy, maybe at a break, if anybody's interested, like in the post office murals. That was a different program. I can talk about that for a long time. But today I'll be focusing on one program in particular and then kind of a secondary program, which was the WPA's Federal Art Project, which ran from 1935 to 1943. And it was targeted at the visual arts and was the largest of the WPA's art and culture programs. There was also a federal theater project, a federal writers project, a federal music project. Most of those had a presence in Kansas, but the Federal Art Project, both in Kansas and nationally, was the largest of these programs. And the Federal Art Project nationally employed more than 10,000 artists and craft workers who produced more than 225,000 works of art during the 9 years of the program's existence. That's pretty astounding. And Federal Art Project artists created murals, sculptures, oil paintings, watercolors, engaged in various types of printmaking, posters, basically all kinds of mediums of art. The Federal Art Project also created more than 100 community centers community art centers across the U.S., which created spaces for art education classes and exhibition spaces for artists. I will say that sometimes you'll run it, I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. Some of the pieces of art, especially in this exhibition, will kind of talk about WPA Federal Art Project art. Some of it actually came from a precursor program called the Public Works of Art Project, which ran from 33 to 34. So when I talk about Federal Art Project art in Kansas, I'm including sort of this precursor project in there. It's just something to note. Let's see. So in Kansas, so the way that the WPA's Federal Art Project was organized is essentially each state kind of had its own separate administrative system. And each state kind of had its own head of the program. So for a couple years, John Helm was the head of the Kansas Federal Art Project. After him, it was Mary Huntoon, who I'll talk about in a minute. So the Federal Art Project, the WPA's Federal Art Project, had actually a pretty significant presence in Kansas for a state of its size. I mean, obviously, states like New York, California, Illinois, Pennsylvania had very significant Federal Art Project programs. But for a relatively small state, Kansas had a very active Federal Art Project. And I think a lot of that has to do with this longer history, right, that precedes the New Deal. So this is a process that I'm still documenting. The research is not yet 100% complete. So far, I have documented around 65 artists in Kansas who worked under the payroll of the Kansas, either the Federal Art Project or that precursor program, and there may be many more that are undocumented. The Kansas Federal Art Project was quite active in the category of paintings, watercolors, and most especially, because of this history in Kansas, printmaking. And a lot of the non-public art, the non-mural output of New Deal arts programs in Kansas, a lot of it is printmaking, which makes sense, right? We have the Prairie printmakers, we have Sanzane. And that was also part of this whole democratizing art, right? Prints are affordable. So the sources that I've looked through so far indicate I've been able to document titles for over 1,500 individual pieces of art produced by the Kansas Federal Art Project and the Precursor Project, including oils, pastels, watercolors, various types of prints. However, so this is in the archives, I've been able to find documentation for around 1,500 individual pieces. But in terms of what I and others can physically find in existence today at institutions, it's about 250 individual pieces. Now, I'm not counting every single run of a print. So when I say that, I mean like if a print had, was a run of 20, I'm counting that as one. So when I'm thinking of individual pieces. So it's still a lot of this, unfortunately, when New Deal art was sort of on the decline and people didn't see it as important or they didn't see it as quote, good art, this would have been maybe the 50s, the 60s. It's really kind of the 70s when people come around are starting to be more interested in this art again. But stuff got thrown in the trash can. It got stuck in an attic. Somebody took it home. Maybe it ended up in a garage sale. The nicer stuff walked off, right? So it's really hard, and sometimes people just didn't know what it was, because technically speaking, the federal government owns everything produced by the Federal Art Project, and you can't sell it. Yeah. But that's a different, you know, are they going to go after you? I will not speak to that legally. So artists, Kansas artists such as Mary Huntoon, William Dickerson, David Hicks Overmyer, Charles Rogers, Ted Hawkins, and Margaret Nellis created works for the Kansas Federal Art Project, and as well as that precursor program. I should also note that a number of artists who were from Kansas and then left the state, Aaron Douglas, for example, worked on Federal Art Project artworks in other states. So, you know, Kansas, the Federal Art Project in Kansas was, for a state of its size, pretty impressive, but Kansas artists were also going to New York, going to Chicago, and then also participating in these programs, and that's something else I've been trying to document. The Federal Art Project also established a community art center in Topeka, which doesn't exist anymore, it's a parking lot, and held art shows across the state, often in conjunction with existing organizations like women's clubs, which we've talked about as being important in this history, and the Kansas Federation of Art. I think Fabian Wolf and John Helm were both instrumental in kind of the reinvigoration of the Kansas Federation of Art in the early 1930s. So there's all of these local organizations within Kansas that are already sort of active in promoting art in spaces like schools and libraries and public areas. And so the New Deal in Kansas is kind of, is piggybacking on those existing networks in a lot of ways. So, and it should be noted that a number of Kansas Federal Art Project pieces were specifically placed in schools. It's kind of hard to estimate how many. I mean, there isn't like a great piece of archival information that says this is how many went to schools, but this was true all over the U.S. The Federal Art Project was placing a lot of objects in schools. In Chicago, for example, as Liz told in her story, actually the Federal Art Project did a number of murals in public schools. Topeka High is the only school in Kansas that has Federal Art Project murals that are still in existence, but a lot of the prints went to schools in Kansas. So really quickly, there was a small public art output of the Kansas Federal Art Project, but many of them went to schools. So you'll see in this exhibition is the David Hicks Overmyer piece, The Pageant of England, from 1937, which hangs in the English room at Topeka High. I will say I went to Topeka High, and I did not know this was there, but you know, when I was 16, I didn't care about art, right? So there's also a large mural, unfinished mural, that takes up 3 walls of the teacher's lounge, also done by David Hicks Overmyer at Topeka High, which was funded by the Federal Art Project. And then when you go through the exhibition, you'll learn more about that story and why Overmyer walked off and didn't finish it. But it's still there. It's absolutely beautiful. I've also been able to document that grade school murals were funded by the Federal Art Project in Holton and in Independence. This is actually the former Washington Grade School in Independence, which is now a independent living community. It says, and you can see there's these wonderful kind of reliefs of Washington and Longfellow on the side of the school, but as far as I've been able to figure out, the murals are gone, unfortunately. And the other school, there was a Lincoln School also in Independence which received murals, and it's been demolished. I have archival evidence that I still haven't really been able to figure out what happened of Federal Art Project murals in other schools, Atchison, Greenleaf, Dodge City. I'm still tracking them down and trying to find out what happened, but you know, it's possible they were never completed, they were painted over. But again, the public art output, the mural output of the Federal Art Project in Kansas at the K-12 level wasn't that great. I should say, though, that there are some pieces of public art that were done by the Federal Art Project and that precursor program and institutions of higher education. So if you go over to Hale Library here at Kansas State University, you'll see also by David Hicks Overmeyer a series of 4 murals that he did. There were murals that were done in the student union at KU that the Federal Art Project funded. Unfortunately, does anyone know what happened to the union at KU in 1970? It burned down. I have images of those murals. I have records that there were also murals at the Manhattan Public Library. So again, it's not a school, but I'm trying to track those down, Liz. I don't know. Yeah, I've had some communication about those. But so I'll just say this really briefly. There was an extensive mural program in Kansas for post offices. There are 29 pieces of public art at 26 post offices, or what were originally post offices. That was a different program. That was the section of fine arts, which was a treasury program. So, but a similar philosophy. Let's put art in these public spaces, like a post office, where everybody can walk into and engage with something that's beautiful and also connects with them and their community and their history. So it's a similar philosophy. But as I said, the Kansas Federal Art Project really, when we think of their output, especially what went to schools, it was prints. So I mentioned Mary Huntoon briefly, and this piece that's on the top left, which is Tower, which is actually an image of the Topeka High Tower, which was her alma mater, mine too. That's in the exhibition. Liz also showed this piece, to the right of it, Kansas Landscape. So these were a couple of pieces that in Mary Huntoon's own papers, she indicated went to school districts. And she actually took over from John Helm. She was a printmaker as well, but she also was an arts administrator and was the head of the Kansas Federal Art Project from about 1937, I think, to maybe 39. And so when both Helm and then later Huntoon were in charge of the Kansas Federal Art Project, they are actively trying to get this print output into school districts. Around 60 separate prints, I have evidence of around 60 separate prints were created by Kansas printmakers under the auspices of the Federal Art Project and its precursor program, the PWAP. Archival records indicate that about 1/2 of William Dickerson and Mary Huntoon's Federal Art Project prints were intended for schools in the state, and each of those had a run of about 100. And I currently have records of, I put 12 here, it's probably up to 15 at this point, school districts in Kansas receiving around 70 prints, remember because there's multiple copies, by Huntoon, by Dickerson, by Marguerite Nellis, and Charles Rogers. And Corey mentioned Charles Rogers, who was a student of San Zane, also did the post office mural in Council Grove. Marguerite Nellis was also a Kansas printmaker. We don't have as much information about her, but this is just sort of a sampling of the kinds of images that were being sent to schools in Kansas, as well as libraries, as well as local museums and other kinds of public institutions. So Mary Huntoon's Tower, Kansas Landscape. This is, I don't have, William Dickerson's Industrial Wichita #1, Charles Rogers' Twilight on the Plains, and I didn't put the information for this one. This is it Haskell Student? This is Marguerite Nellis's print Haskell Student. And I'll talk about this print a little bit more. But, one thing, because I'm a history teacher, one thing that I often use a collection of images like these to think about is, what does this collection of subject matters tell us about what images connected to Kansans in the 1930s, in this time of sort of great upheaval? What kind of images did we want to see? Because it's important to note that New Deal arts programs, especially in the Midwest, I would say, reflect this style of art at the time called American Scene. An American Scene is, it's both a naturalistic style of painting, but it's also about depicting scenes of typical American life and landscape. And in this part of the country, that really manifests as a style called regionalism, right? So Benton, so Curry, all the trifecta, right? And, so it's really about everyday people, everyday spaces, and the New Deal arts programs really emphasize to artists, connect to that local community, right? Produce images that are about the culture, the economy, the history of the area that you're producing that image for, right? So that's very much a part of this. I do want to note really quickly that there were a couple school districts, Topeka Public Schools and Winfield Public Schools, that received New Deal art from other states. So when the programs ended in 1943, a lot of the states that had a lot of New Deal art being produced, like New York, like Illinois, California, the federal government tried to just unload all of them. So Topeka High got 4 pieces, or Topeka Public Schools got 4 of those. They don't have any of them anymore. The image that is being used as the main image for this exhibition, Ethel Spears, the WPA cutting down a tree, was originally owned by the Topeka School District and then somehow went into private collection and now is here at the Beach Museum. The Winfield School District was allocated 4 pieces and still has 3 of them. So, and Harlem Fish Market is here in this exhibition. But most of the New Deal pieces in schools in Kansas were produced by Kansas artists in Kansas, but there are a few exceptions. There is one other program that you'll see represented in this exhibition, which was a WPA program that produced a tremendous amount of objects for specifically educational purposes, and that's the Museum Extension Project. It was technically not a New Deal arts project, and about 23 states they were either called Visual Education Program, Museum Project, Museum Extension Project, various names, and they provided educational visual aids to schools, libraries, local museums, and other similar institutions. And Kansas, again for a state of its size, had a very active museum extension program, employing more than 200 individuals in at least 10 workshops across the state and creating over 15,000 individual items that were then placed, I say they were sold, but at very small costs, in at least 60 institutions, such as local museums, libraries, and schools. So this program produced a variety of objects for instructional use, including a series of prints of native wildflowers and birds, dioramas of historical scenes, miniature replicas of historic buildings and vehicles, health posters, weaving kits, full-size mission-style furniture. The 1940 Kansas Museum Extension Project catalog states the program's purpose was to, quote, awaken interest in historic and cultural backgrounds and to stimulate appreciation and contemporary creative expression. So again, kind of a similar goal. The most recognizable product of the Kansas Museum Extension Project, and I see these at local history museums all over the state, are the set of dolls. So 2 series of 24 sets of dolls. There were the foreign costume dolls and the American historical costumes. And there are 3 sets of dolls that are featured in this exhibition. One which is generically called Indian, and I'll mention that towards the end of my talk, which will be over soon. Russia, and then 1730 from American costumes. But this is one of the most complete set of dolls I've ever seen. That's the Crawford County Historical Society in Pittsburgh. So, and they're paper mache, they're pretty fragile. A lot of times they're in terrible condition, but a lot of times too, they're not in bad condition. So, as a teaching aid, I think, we can think of the original purpose of dolls being something that's accessible and interesting to children. But I think from a contemporary lens, we can also think, why these countries? Why these cultures? What does that tell us about how Kansans and Americans sort of viewed the world in the 1930s? And how would we do this differently today? So for example, the countries represented are essentially all European countries, plus India and Mexico, right? So again, this is a pedagogical tool of, who's being represented and who's not, and why. Right? And how maybe we would do things differently today, but also this is a lesson in that era. probably the second most recognizable output of the Kansas Museum Project are a series of Kansas landmark prints by Margaret Whittemore, and there's a series of 49 of these. And I see these on eBay all the time, but they are everywhere. I will say this is a quick encouragement to dig through the storage areas of like all your schools, because I found a Margaret Whittemore print in a flat file at Topeka High with like a 1980s football poster on top of it. And they've now framed it and hung it at the school. So, you know, this is the kind of stuff that just people put in a flat file and they don't think about it. So Whittemore decided to create a series of these 49 prints to represent the sort of the sort of natural beauty of Kansas. So there's things like Rock City near Minneapolis, and there's the Council Oak and Council Grove, but also the human history. And I will say it's overwhelmingly a history of people of European descent, right? The only sort of representation of indigenous people is in images of missions. And this print of Shawnee Mission is, a version of it is in the exhibition. So again, pedagogically, there's this question again, why this collection? You know, what story was it telling people about the history of Kansas and Kansas culture in the 1930s? And what does it today tell us about, you know, how people were identifying in the 1930s in this time of tumultuous sort of upheaval, economic upheaval and a world war? And how would we do it different today? Whose stories aren't a part of this collection that maybe we would tell? I will just very briefly say that Berger Sanzane in 1918 wrote to Kansas Governor Capper and essentially suggested a Kansas landmark series of prints. And Governor Capper said, we're kind of fighting a world war now, and also pretty soon there's going to be a flu pandemic, so no, we're not going to fund that. So this is sort of where I'm going to end. Because I think, and there's a significant part of the exhibition that deals with these questions, so I'm more than happy to talk to people individually about it as you go through the exhibition. But there's a lot of these objects from the Museum Extension Project, and then also this image from the Federal Art Project, that purport to represent Native Americans. You know, some of them a little bit more, let's say, complex in their representation. So there's these dioramas that Liz talked about, and there's a digital station in the exhibition where you can look at these dioramas. The dioramas were made in Lawrence, and my research indicates that, you know, there was a lot of consultation with the Kansas State Historical Society about how to represent things like the Kiowa Eagle dance. You know, these are from the All Nations dolls. You know, these are very problematic in the sense that it's this super generic Indian, right? And I think we can understand why today this wouldn't be acceptable. You know, then there's things like Marguerite Nellis's Haskell student, which to me is a very kind of sympathetic rendering of a student. But we can also, I think, use these objects to ask the question, you know, why aren't indigenous artists representing themselves in WPA programs? You know, why aren't, Nellis actually also did images of African American students, you know, and again, the only artist represented in this collection is Aaron Douglas, who left Kansas at 18. Right? So I think there's a deeper set of questions here about the idea of art for all. Who is all? You know, who gets to tell their story and who doesn't? Who gets to represent themselves and who has others represent them? The New Deal was really great in providing jobs for women. About 20% of all artists who worked for the New Deal were women, which was pretty amazing at the time, but most of them were white women. And, you know, there are no, with one exception, there's really no people of color in Kansas working for any of these New Deal arts programs. So I think that also is a point of discussion, right? What does democratizing art mean when schools are segregated? And so I think those are hard but important questions that this kind of art can raise. I will just end by noting, and you can learn more about this in the exhibition, there is one exception to non-white artists working for WPA arts programs in Kansas. There's a series of beadwork items made by members of the Prairie Band Potawatomi at a Mayetta workshop in the WPA. And through my research and the research of others, we've been able to sort of reconnect the tribe with these objects. They didn't know that they existed. They'd lost cultural knowledge. And the KU Spencer Museum of Art actually has a number of those. So, you know, we have these very culturally specific, beautifully rendered beadwork, you know, with this exquisite craftsmanship. But the Museum Extension Project catalog labeled them as Indian craft. So again, there's this disconnect between that cultural specificity and how sort of it was how school children were meant to consume these objects. And I think part of your guys' job, all of our jobs as educators, is to make those connections. And I think, you know, these programs can help us do that. So that's all I got.